Hi there, and welcome back to the second episode of my Video Nasty series. I'm Dr. Sparkle, and today we're going to take a look at sort of an unusual little film. As I mentioned in the first episode, by 1982 the successful obscenity prosecutions of several films resulted in a series of police raids on video stores as well as the offices of video labels and distributors. Now, the odd thing about The Burning was it ended up being a Video Nasty entirely due to an error. Unlike most other Nasties, this was not put out by a tiny independent video label, but by Thorn EMI, which was for a time the name used in the UK for the company created when the electrical company Thorn merged with EMI, the massive music company. Thorn EMI had submitted the film to the BBFC, who required some cuts but did approve it with an X rating. However, somehow the uncut version ended up being the one that was actually released on the tape. Eventually someone noticed, and in 1983 the police raided Thorn EMI's offices and hauled away a bunch of copies. It was reissued with the cut version, but the banned uncut version on the tape became the big collector's item. If you know nothing about The Burning other than the rather unattractive box cover, you might think this looks like a super cheap, sleazy piece of crap that deserves to be forgotten. In fact, of all the Nasties, this probably has the highest concentration of high-profile names and award-winning talent. Among the various people involved, we have winners of awards from the Oscars, the Emmys, the Golden Globes, the Tonys, BAFTA, Cannes. Hell, in the UK this is actually distributed by George Harrison's company, Handmade Films, when it was in theaters. At the moment, at least, it has a Rotten Tomatoes critics rating of 100%, though all the reviews are from horror specialist sites. Still, it's now considered a minor classic of 80s horror, at least in the US.
This summer, if you're planning to go camping,
After starting off the Video Nasty series with Driller Killer, a rather grimy little movie, I thought we'd follow up with an absolutely beautiful looking movie. Miramax's 1981 slasher movie, The Burning.
The Burning.
Now right off the bat, the first thing we notice when we fire up the current video release of this is the fucking MGM logo. Well, obviously MGM did not make this movie, but you know, nowadays film studios are not so much actual studios as they are collections of intellectual properties which are frequently bought and sold. The original US distributor was Filmways, who, aside from movies, was actually mostly involved with TV shows back in the 50s and 60s, stuff like Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, The Addams Family. In the early 1980s, they were bought out by Orion Pictures, an independent film company that had various big hits like RoboCop and Silence of the Lambs, but eventually went bankrupt and basically got absorbed into MGM in 1997. And funnily enough, MGM, once the classiest film studio, now has the rights to all kinds of trashy horror movies which get released under the Scream Factory imprint. Scream Factory being a subsidiary of Shout Factory, which is the company founded by the guys from Rhino Records after they sold out Rhino to Warner Brothers. By the way, Rhino once had a distribution deal with Capitol Records, who were owned by EMI, who had merged with the British electronics company Thorn to form Thorn EMI, which released the British videotape version that became a Video Nasty. That is just a coincidence, but it just shows how crazy the music and film businesses became in the 70s and 80s.
Let's see what you got.
So these kids are pulling a prank on the weird, despised groundskeeper named Cropsy. Apparently everyone hates Cropsy, so they plan to scare him by putting a burning, worm-covered skull near his bed and then waking him up. Naturally, he freaks out, accidentally sets himself on fire, and, well, you know, that's why the movie is called The Burning, and this is where the UK VHS box art comes from. On a rather sad note, the stuntman who's actually doing the burn scene was a very young kid named Reed Rondell, son of the great stuntman Ronnie Rondell. A couple years after this, he was actually killed in an accident doing stunt work on the TV show Airwolf.
Come on, Spag. Come on. Come on.
We then flash forward to the hospital where we get a couple scenes of some extremely unprofessional doctors gawking at the burned Cropsy.
You ain't never gonna forget this man.
As long as you live, you're never gonna
I mean, these guys are huge assholes, basically daring each other to look at the guy's injuries. Are these like actual adult doctors? I mean, they're acting like 15-year-olds. But yeah, the scene lets you know that Cropsey ended up looking pretty bad, without really showing you that much. We then get the rather plain credits over the Rick Wakeman score. This is the first movie made by Miramax, it seems. So about the soundtrack, it's by the great prog keyboardist Rick Wakeman. The Burning's director, Tony Malum, had worked with Wakeman before on a film called White Rock. Actually, for White Rock, he says he originally hired Yes to do the score, but logistical problems prevented all 5 of them from assembling at one time, so he settled on just Wakeman. When making The Burning, he decided, hey, he already had Wakeman's number, so I'll call him up again. We then get a 5 years later title card, and Cropsey is released from the hospital, apparently still in horribly disfigured form. We also get some great period footage of 1980 Buffalo, New York. Cropsey picks up a rather haggard-looking prostitute who freaks out when she catches a glimpse of his face.
Oh my God. Who are you? Leave me alone. Please.
And then we get the first murder scene. The Burning encountered various issues with ratings boards both in the US and the UK, and parts of the scene were originally edited. While not too gory, the bit with the scissors sort of plunging into the lady's flabby stomach is rather visceral and a bit icky. And while this part has nothing to do with the rest of the movie plot-wise, apparently Harvey Weinstein's theory was you have to have like some gore or a scare or something every 10 minutes approximately, so this kind of kicks that off. And then the scene transitions into the film proper. Great transition here between the violent death scene and the wonderfully shot scene of the lake. So let's talk a little bit about how and why this movie came about. Something that comes up a lot in the Video Nasties list is what we call like American regional horror movies. Movies not associated with Hollywood, but with independent filmmakers scattered throughout the country. And basically, The Burning is one of these. As I mentioned, this is the first Miramax production, and its roots go back to the early 70s when a young man named Harvey Weinstein and his friend Corky Burger started a rock promotion business called Harvey and Corky Productions. That is, they would book rock concerts and so on. Back in the 70s, most of this stuff was run by small companies. This is all like, pre-Ticketmaster and all that stuff. Meanwhile, over in the UK, a British actor turned director named Tony Malum made a series of documentaries and TV shows. Among them was the 1976 film Genesis in Concert, filmed shortly after Peter Gabriel left the band, and kind of capturing the moment when drummer Phil Collins began his transition into goofy frontman Phil Collins. This concert movie was quite successful in the UK, as was another movie Malum made around the same time, White Rock, a documentary about the 1976 Winter Olympics, which had lots of beautifully shot slow-mo footage. As I said a few minutes ago, it was set to a Rick Wakeman soundtrack. Harvey Weinstein saw these films in London and decided to release them together in the US, or at least in the northeastern part of the US, in 1977 under the name Sensasia, sort of a music film event. Supposedly this was quite successful, and Harvey and Corky had some success with local film distribution at this time, but what Harvey really wanted was to go into film production. He had come up with an idea for a movie based around the New York urban legend of Cropsey, a psychotic killer which may have been based on a real person, perhaps not. The story of Cropsey was often told around campfires and such in New York in the 70s, and the movie actually does contain one such campfire scene.
Burned alive, he cried out, "I will return! I will have..."
Anyway, Weinstein contacted Malum and asked him if he wanted to direct this movie he was going to produce. Malum brought out an associate of his, Peter Lawrence, to write the script. According to Malum, the script was a product of Harvey and Bob Weinstein, Peter Lawrence, and Malum himself, though Lawrence wrote most of the actual script. One fellow, Brad Gray, has his name in the credits as both producer and as contributing to the original story. But Malum does not recall him being involved at all in the script or the shooting. He was actually a friend of Harvey's and the manager of one of the actors. Supposedly a number of the names in the credits were friends, backers, etc., rather than people who actually worked on the film itself. As for Brad Gray, he ended up probably about the most successful person in this film after the Weinsteins. He went into TV production, and his company was responsible for News Radio, Mr. Show, Larry Sanders, and The Sopranos. He has a closet full of Emmy Awards, and is now actually the CEO of Paramount Pictures. Other big names here? Well, there's Eric Van Haren Noman. He became a big TV cinematographer and has plenty of Emmys to his credit. He was also apparently involved in the Panaglide, which was like an early competitor to the Steadicam before the two somehow merged into one product. The editor, Jack Shoulder, had just come from editing trailers at New Line Cinema. A few years after this, he would actually go on to direct Nightmare on Elm Street 2. So, the first third of the main story is designed to introduce the characters, throw in a few minor scares, and kind of prep you for the second act, which is when the killings actually start happening. So in the finest 80s movie tradition, the casting of teenagers is a little bit creative, but The Burning has kind of a slightly weird feel, since it has actors whose ages run from like 14 all the way to, about 30, all of them playing teenage characters.
You're coming down on the wrong guy. He's the one that was caught looking at the girls in the shower. You ought to be coming down hard on him.
You know what your problem is?
And of course, to keep the audience's attention, it throws in a bit of nudity. The main character, if there is one, is Alfred, sort of a weird loner kid who does some sort of, socially unacceptable stuff, like trying to scare a female camper in the shower.
Alfred's been prowling around the girls' shower. Karen, take Sally a kibble.
There's also a bit of inter-character tension between Alfred and Glazer, the thuggish boyfriend of Sally, the girl who Alfred frightened. Glazer, being the cretinous bully character, will of course get killed off later. Brian Backer, the actor who plays Alfred, you might remember from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and he won a Tony Award about a year after this for a performance in Woody Allen's play The Floating Light, where he basically plays Woody Allen. Other actors making their debuts here, well, obviously there's Jason Alexander, whose talent was apparently pretty obvious to the other cast and crew at this time. And some of his characters' lines may have been like ad-libs from Alexander.
Oh, God bless her mom and dad. You guys are a real bunch of wimps, you know that?
He looks pretty young here, but he's only about 9 years away from starring in Seinfeld. So the first season of Seinfeld is actually about the midpoint between The Burning and the final season of Seinfeld. I guess he lost a lot of hair in those 9 years. And he also, before starting Seinfeld, won a Tony Award as well.
Absolutely, huh? Absolutely shit, man. Look, I asked for lubricated rubbers. These aren't lubricated rubbers, you understand that?
What am I, Masters and Johnson? You want lubes, buy your own.
All right, I'll buy my own. But let me tell you something, pal. I ain't paying for these. You got that?
I got that.
Also making his debut here is Fisher Stevens, playing the nerdy Woodstock. Stevens went on to appear in many movies and TV shows, for example, the Mario Brothers movie, eventually becoming an esteemed producer, and he produced Robert Altman's last film, Prairie Home Companion, and won an Oscar for his documentary on Japanese dolphin hunting, The Cove. So again, humble beginnings for someone who went on to big things. And finally, Holly Hunter has a very small role here, but hey, it's another future Oscar winner in the cast. The first act is pretty heavy on goofy fun and light on scares, though in one scene we briefly see Cropsy's face. No one believes Alfred, and there's a sort of a bit of a boy who cried wolf element to the movie, because, characters doubt there really is a killer on the loose. Special effects man Tom Savini says one thing he liked about The Burning is the characters seemed fun and cool, and you were shocked when they got killed as opposed to Friday the 13th, where you hated the characters and just wanted them to die. The second act is the stalk and slash section. A group of campers go on an overnight rafting trip down the river. And here's just sort of like another example of some of the great cinematography in this movie. Cropsy, who it appears has sort of been hanging around the edges of the movie, apparently follows him up there somehow. But it's not clear how he does this. Does he have his own boat? The movie never clarifies. The kids do their typical horny teen stuff like skinny dipping. Trouble begins when this guy tries to pressure his girlfriend into sex. She quickly leaves, only to find someone has scattered her clothes around the forest. This is actually a pretty creepy scene, and we're not quite sure if this is going to be like another fake out or if Cropsy is actually going to start slicing up teenagers at this point.
Where are my clothes? Come on, please.
Which of course, is what happens. Now, The Burning was released in US theaters in May 1981, right in the middle of the slasher film explosion. In fact, Friday the 13th Part 2 had hit theaters the week before, and Happy Birthday to Me, which was directed by a very well-respected British director, oddly enough, came out the next week. Happy Birthday to Me will turn up in the Video Nasties series at some point in the future. It's hard to say how much of an influence Friday the 13th had directly on this film. Its creation really couldn't have been inspired by actually seeing Friday the 13th, which was released in May 1980. According to the director, The Burning was shot in the summer, which must have meant summer 1980, so pre-production would have been already well underway by the time Friday the 13th actually came out. And then again, supposedly the basic idea and the script had been worked up a bit earlier. If anything, The Burning more resembles Halloween. Remember, the first Friday the 13th movie was actually a mystery movie. We didn't know who the killer was until the end. It was sort of like Agatha Christie's 10 Little Indians, or the Italian Giallos, whereas The Burning established exactly who the killer was from the very beginning. It started with his origin story, and then he spends the movie stalking his victims, much like Halloween's Michael Myers. As for the director Peter Malem, it's not clear whether he had even seen Friday the 13th. If anything, Alien is kind of the template for The Burning, Alien being a film that Malem much admired, and which to him seemed kind of like, the ideal horror movie. Regardless, the financing I'm sure was helped along by the horror boom that was happening around that time. It certainly helped the film find distribution. According to Malem, it was brought to the very first American Film Market event in February 1981 and was quickly sold in every major market. So The Burning turned a profit for its producers immediately. If there's a single scene that you will remember from The Burning, it's this one. The campers have discovered all their canoes are missing, as well as one camper, who we now know was killed by Cropsey. A makeshift raft is built so a group of kids can paddle upstream to the camp and bring back help.
Come on, we're not...
Hey, you guys, look over there! What? It's one of our canoes! It is, it's ours!
They then see one of their canoes drifting down the river and begin frantically rowing trying to reach it. The editor, Jack Shoulder, said that when he first edited this, Harvey Weinstein looked at it and said, "No, make it longer." So he did, and Harvey said, "Make it even longer." So he lengthened the scene, and again Harvey went, "No, I want this even longer." And Shoulder was like, "Is this guy crazy? How long does he want this thing?" But it actually works. The row towards the canoe is like over a minute long, and something is going to happen, but this tension just builds and builds as you get closer bit by bit, and you keep thinking, how long can this go on? And then of course we get this amazing brutal mass murder scene, which is like a huge set piece for Tom Savini effects. And this, along with the bit where the lady gets stabbed at the beginning with the scissors, drew the most attention from censors. It's actually a pretty shocking scene. Not only are these young kids, but you don't expect to see, like half the campers get killed off in 20 seconds. Especially since the first hour has been pretty stingy with the gore. And if anyone here brings a Friday the 13th feel to the movie, it's Tom Savini, who manages some clever but inexpensive effects. He took the job on The Burning because he thought the script for Friday the 13th Part 2 was pretty stupid, and he just didn't like the idea of Jason, who was, dead, being the killer in the second movie. Malin himself actually portrays Cropsey in many of the scenes, and said he was actually the only one who could correctly hold the shears so the light would reflect off it just right. At this point, the social bonds holding together the campers begin fraying. Glazer and his girlfriend sneak off, and she gets deflowered in an unsatisfying fashion.
That's all. Is it?
The audiences, I think, will probably experience a bit of schadenfreude here at the unlikable Glazer not being able to live up to his girlfriend's expectations. Of course, they both get killed as well. Not sure if this is an example of the horror film's supposed punishment of its characters for having sex. Sure, two couples died after sex for skin dipping, but is this really some kind of moral judgment on the filmmaker's part, or is it just an excuse to separate them from a larger group? And of course, show some nudity. This is a rather simple but effective special effect here. Glazer is holding himself up by his arms on a rig which is being moved by some members of the film crew. And the hedge clippers are specially constructed so they go around his neck but still have points which can be sunk into the tree.
God.
Alfred, who exhibits some sexually deviant tendencies throughout the movie, was spying on Glazer and Sally. Suddenly the killer's existence is revealed, first to the camp counselor Todd, who conveniently gets knocked out by Cropsey, and later by the fellow camp counselor Michelle, when the floating raft containing the bodies of the slaughtered campers drifts downstream. At this point, the third and final act begins, as Alfred is stalked by Cropsey, with Todd in hot pursuit. Now, an important thing to consider about this movie is The Burning was a completely mercenary film. This is not a passion project for the people involved. The director and the writer were hired hands. Other than Savini, the people involved here really had no love or even much familiarity with horror movies. Malum has never done another horror movie since this, and when he recorded his commentary for the recent video release, he had not even seen the film since it came out. It was just a job for him. Even Shoulder, the editor, who later was involved in Nightmare Before Elm Street, didn't even really like horror movies personally. For the Weinsteins, it was more of an opportunity to break into the movie production business, since these kind of movies were getting popular. They hired guys to make the movie, and those guys did the best job they could do, and then went on to their next job. The Burning is not any sort of personal project. There was no, auteur in this movie. It wasn't like John Carpenter with Halloween or Tobe Hooper with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was not like a personal movie for anyone. A couple things happened during production. First of all, there was another film called The Burning being made around the same time, which ended up changing its name to Don't Go in the House, even though it was released before The Burning began shooting. By a strange coincidence, that film also ended up on the Video Nasty list and has a connection to The Sopranos as well, which we'll cover at some point, I suppose. And there was a second Cropsey film in production at the same time. To avoid confusion with The Burning, they dropped the Cropsey angle and released the film under the name Madman in 1982. Madman has a nice little cult following, but it never became a Video Nasty. I love this great little scene where Michelle tries to convince the guy in charge of the camp that, yes, there really is a maniac who has killed a bunch of people.
Listen to me, there is a killer out there.
Oh, come on, Michelle. Todd put you up to
God damn it, look at those kids.
Much of the end of the movie is a chase sequence as Cropsey hunts down Alfred, but only, as it turns out later, in order to draw in Todd. So one question I wonder is, where exactly was The Burning filmed? I mean, it's a great location. Malum said it was somewhere south of Buffalo and recalls it being about an hour drive by car each day to the filming location. The credits give thanks to something called Mickey Rat's, which turns out to be a bar or eatery in Angola, which is a bit south of Buffalo. I was thinking maybe they were the caterer or something. However, the other cast members, including Savini and Shoulder and some actors, state definitively it was filmed near North Tonawanda, which is just a few miles north of Buffalo. Shoulder even remembers the name of the place they stayed at. It was called the Packet Inn. Perhaps Malum was thinking of one of the movie's other locations, like this abandoned copper mine, where the film's climax takes place in. Originally the script had this taking place in a cave, but there were some problems with the cave they were going to use. Malum says there turned out to be too many bats in the cave, which would have interfered with the shooting. Savini tells a more colorful story. While some of the crew, including Savini, were exploring the cave, a cave-in happened, and they had to dig their way out. Thus the cave was deemed too unstable and dangerous to shoot in. The climactic battle is a bit disappointing compared to what came before. Even Malum admits he could have improved it had he had more time. Weinstein did some fooling around with the final version. For example, this still photo of one of the victims is sort of crudely inserted here. I think this is supposed to indicate that Cropsey took the body back to his lair. Two important things do happen in this part, though. We learn that Todd was one of the kids that set Cropsey on fire 5 years earlier.
Sure. Snoop, I'm in. Billy, I can't stand this little bitch. What about you, Todd?
And Cropsey's apparently trying to get revenge on him, I think. That is supposedly the film's intentions, but this raises a few questions. How does Cropsey know who he was, or that he was still going to the same camp every summer? Were the kids' identities known, meaning did they get caught? Earlier in the movie, Todd alludes to something happening that caused him to almost get kicked out of camp.
I sort of know what you're going through. 5 years ago, when I was in summer camp, I didn't just get bawled out by the counselor, I got sent home. You did? Yeah.
Is that referring to the whole incident with Cropsey? I mean, can you set a guy on fire at a camp and not get expelled from the camp? At least Cropsey would have sued the holy fuck out of the kid's parents, right? But then there's this. I mean, the guy sets a dude on fire and then makes a campfire tale about it. I mean, that's just cold-blooded. No wonder Cropsey's pissed. I mean, not only does this guy like horrifyingly scar him for life, but then pretty much brags about it every summer. But of course, this is all fridge logic. I mean, you don't necessarily have time to think about this while watching the movie. Also, we finally get a good look at Cropsey's face, which was designed by Savini. Another question was, how successful was The Burning financially? 1981 was a big year for slashers and horror movies. We had Friday the 13th Part 2, Halloween 2, My Bloody Valentine, The Prowler, Happy Birthday to Me, Graduation Day, not to mention some very successful non-slasher movies like The Howling, American Werewolf in London, Omen 3. The Burning was not nearly as high profile as any of those, yet it is said to have made money. Now, for some reason, on its list of #1 box office films in 1981, The Burning is the #1 film in the US for the week of May 10th, which I'm sure is absolutely not anywhere close to true. I assumed whoever made this list was just copying directly out of like back issues of Variety or something, but maybe not. The Burning has gradually gathered up a substantial cult following over the years, to the point where if someone said it was their favorite slasher movie, that would seem like a totally acceptable opinion. In the UK, it doesn't seem to have much of a following among folks who actually study the Nasties. The authors of See No Evil call it unremarkable. Kim Newman calls it entirely ordinary. But it really is a well-made film. Especially on the high-definition version, it looks fantastic. There was really a lot of talent involved in this film. I mean, the characters are memorable and likable when they need to be, and unlikable when that's required. The shocks are effective, the special effects are clever. It's really a pretty easy movie to love. The film certainly has its followers. Video game fans will of course remember the character of Scissorman from the Clock Tower video games. Director Hifumi Kono had seen The Burning and based that character on Cropsey. So my final conclusion, The Burning is a great slasher movie and one of the most interesting and enjoyable movies on the Nasties list. So that wraps it up for today. Next time we'll dive into something a bit more obscure, and I hope to see you then.
Waiting. So don't look. He'll see you. Don't breathe. He'll hear you.